Omówiono najważniejsze sprawy związane z dalszym rozwojem województwa i kraju.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Do You Believe on livesci-fi.tv. Thanks so much for joining us. Oh, and please, would you please give us a like and please subscribe to the channel? We'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I'm so excited. I have Joshua Zeman with us tonight, and Joshua, oh my God, he took time out. He's very busy. He's a director, a writer, and a producer, and he does so many documentaries, and he's a very busy person, and I'm just thrilled to have him on the show tonight. Josh, thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh. Now, Joshua, would you please tell the viewers about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a documentary filmmaker, do other sorts of narrative stuff as well, and a couple years ago I co-directed a feature documentary called Cropsy, and most recently I did another documentary investigative doc for the Chiller channel called Killer Legends.
Yes, and that was awesome. Now you're working on a current project as well.
Yeah, currently I'm working on another documentary project about the Gilgo Beach murders. Some people may know that as the Long Island serial killer, and that is basically they found 10 online escorts or escort workers dead in Long Island a couple years ago, and to this day they still have not caught the guy who did it, and they believe he'll come back. He's seasonal. And so this documentary kind of picks up where the police investigation left off, and a lot of it is about just the changing face of crime on the internet.
Awesome. I hope you come back and do another show with us.
Yeah, exactly.
So why don't we start with your documentary, Killer Legends?
Sure.
They played it all day on the Chiller channel. It was fabulous. So let's do the show tonight on Killer Legends.
Sure. So basically, off Cropsy, just to give you a little backstory, I did this film called Cropsy that was about this urban legend that we had growing up in Staten Island, New York, and a lot of the kids in my generation, the 80s, late 70s, or early 80s. And that was about an escaped mental patient who lived in the basement of this abandoned mental institution in the middle of Staten Island called the Willowbrook Mental Institution. It had been fairly famous back in the day as being what was called a Snake Pit Mental Institution. And we would always go there as kids and hang out and keg parties and things like that. And we were always told never, to go near the basement because an escaped patient lived in the tunnels there, and his name was Cropsy, and if you wandered away, he would come out and snatch you. We really didn't think anything of it until a little girl with Down syndrome disappeared from our neighborhood. This was in 1987, and after 5 weeks of searching, they found her body buried on the grounds of the mental institution. The police arrested a man. He wasn't an escaped mental patient like the urban legend, but he was a former worker who had lived in a campsite on the grounds. And he had been suspected of taking up to 5 other missing kids, going far back as to 1972, so about 30 years. And so for a lot of the kids in Staten Island, the urban legend came true. And so the question is, what really came first? Was it the urban legend? There's always urban legends about mental institutions. In fact, in American Horror Story, the second season did a whole show about, the kind of horrors that take place around mental institutions, and obviously all the films that we see today are always about mental institutions. So in our culture, we've had urban legends about mental institutions for years, mostly about the overcrowding, a lot of times about the tunnels, and we have urban legends about crazy people because we need to create stories to explain what we don't understand. And a lot of mentally disabled people, their behaviors are strange to us, and so we like to create urban legends with which to explain that.
Mm-hmm. Now, they arrested, who did they arrest for the murders?
His name was Andre Rand, and his mother had actually worked in a similar mental institution. In fact, they were all constructed very similarly. And so in the documentary, if you watch it, you'll kind of see how the community creates an urban legend, and how, as adults, we went back to find out whether the boogeyman of our childhood was real. Now, what was interesting is I went around the country touring with that film, and every audience I would meet, people would like to talk about other urban legends, the popular urban legends we all knew growing up. And the question was always, is there some truth behind these stories? And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the cross-section, the intersection between horror, between urban legend, and true crime, the truth, and where they meet, how they meet, and how they get mixed up to create the stories that continually seem to fascinate us through today. Mm-hmm. So from that, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So from that, we went and looked at some other very popular urban legends and to see if there was any truth behind them. And that's one of the interesting things about urban legends. There's always some sort of truth behind them. That's what makes an urban legend an urban legend. There has to be a true story or some factual elements, and the more factual, the more believable the urban legend is. What happens is you take some facts, you take a real story, and then you embellish upon it. You kind of create your own horror narrative on top of that. So we looked at 4 urban legends. The Hook for a Hand, which is a very famous one about the couple that's making out in some lover's lane, and all of a sudden a voice comes over the radio and says, "Lock your doors, go home. There's an escaped mental patient or lunatic or prisoner, and he's out roaming the countryside, and he has a hook for a hand, so immediately go home."
Okay, so let me finish with Cropsy, because I have a question for you.
Sure.
After they arrested this Andre Rand, did the kidnapping stop and the missing children stop?
That's a very good question. That's the important question that you have to ask. Yes, they did.
They did?
Yeah, they did. So that might lead someone to believe that he might have been responsible. But at the same time, the film is also about the steps that a community will take to kind of create a boogeyman and then stop the boogeyman. And so, in a lot of ways, I don't really know what happened. I don't really know what Andre Rand did or didn't do. A lot of these crimes happened in the past, and they were happening like once every 3 or 4 years. So a lot of things could have happened.
So is he mentally unbalanced?
I believe that he has some form of schizophrenia. Not quite sure. He was sent for a psych evaluation at Kings County Hospital during one of the first trials, and the threshold for whether or not you're competent to stand trial does not mean whether or not you have any mental deficiencies or mentally disabled. It just means whether or not you're competent to stand trial. So it's 2 different variables. And in this case, he was found competent to stand trial, but that doesn't mean he's not mentally disabled or has some sort of mental deficiency. Again, I think he's got schizophrenia, but I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I couldn't really tell you.
So there were, they found Jennifer, and then he was connected to what? To the other 4 children that were missing?
Yeah, there was Holly Ann Hughes, and that was the second trial. So originally what happened was he was convicted on first-degree kidnapping, but not murder for Jennifer Schweiger, although the sentence is the same, 25 years to life. He was then sent to prison. Then the police decided to re-indict him for another little girl who had been taken in 1981. Her name was Holly Ann Hughes. Her body has never been found. and that was the trial. Now, it's interesting. There's a term called corpus delicti, no body, no crime. And so back in the day, if you didn't have a body, it was very hard to prosecute for a crime. And so Jennifer was the only body they ever found. The other four children, their bodies have never been found.
And so, what do they think happened to those bodies? I mean, they found Jennifer because she was in a shallow grave, but why didn't they find the other children?
Well, Jennifer was buried in a shallow grave on the grounds of the mental institution. The mental institution was one of the largest. It's in an area called the Greenbelt, an undeveloped piece of land that sits in the middle of Staten Island. And it's 365 acres. And that's quite a large area. Who knows where he may have buried, if he in fact did the crime, buried the other children. He had campsites in a lot of, lots and stuff on the island. So,
well, didn't he live in the tunnels at the institution?
Well, in fact, a lot of what happened was, and one of the larger themes in the documentary is about what's called deinstitutionalization in the 1970s. Through fiscal crisis and through Reaganomics and through a lot of the policies at the time regarding our mentally ill, rather than warehouse them, which was a horrific thing to do, we decided to let them out, which is both good and bad. Good because it changed the warehousing of individuals. Bad because we did it in an incorrect fashion. A lot of times, we just let people out without much follow-up. There was some transitioning of some mentally disabled into group homes, but others were just left to their own devices on the streets, and that's one of the reasons why we had a homeless problem. And so what happened was a lot of these people, they were brought to Willowbrook as children. You were told to bring your Down syndrome child to Willowbrook and just leave them there. That was the best thing for them. And so what happened was children would be left there. They would grow up in the Willowbrook. They were then let out, and they returned out of confusion and habit. They found their way back, and then some of them lived in tunnels. Some of them lived in campsites, and Andre Rand was one of them, although he was a former worker who had been on the ground. So that, as you can imagine, creates quite a scary scenario for the residents, and fuels a lot of urban legends and a lot of myths and a lot of horror stories.
Now, the other children that were missing as well, they were mentally handicapped as well, weren't they?
Some of them were mentally handicapped. Some, they were marginalized children. Andre Rand, if you watch the documentary, one of the ideas is that Andre Rand had a messiah complex. He believed that he was killing children in an effort to save them from a life of institutionalization or from unwanted parents. And so a lot of what he was doing was kind of finding marginalized children. Now those children are they're easier to take because, let's say there's a dependency issue at home, or because they're mentally disabled and they wander off and things like that. And at the same time, that also fueled why he was taking them.
All right, so go ahead. You done?
No.
Okay, so let's move on now to the Candyman.
Sure, the Killer Legends.
Yes.
So now we're going to talk about Killer Legends, which is the doc that I just did for Chiller with Rachel Mills. She's the researcher. And for that, we decided to look at, again, 4 of our scariest urban legends and the true stories that may or may not have inspired them. One of the urban legends that we all know, and it's not even an urban legend anymore, is about Halloween candy, tainted Halloween candy. Do you think that that's an urban legend?
Do I? No.
Not many people do. It's so commonplace now to scan our candy, to look for them, to see if there's any holes or punctures or anything. And the idea that someone might taint candy is pretty commonplace. But in fact, it's really an urban legend.
It is, really.
Doesn't happen. There's a guy named Joel Best, who's one of the foremost experts on Halloween tainted candy. And he looks at all the cases, and very, very rarely has he found any cases of someone who has been killed or intentionally horrifically hurt by a stranger putting something in candy, razor blades in apples, glass, pins, needles, everything. It's one of these urban legends. It's one of these hysterias that was started in the 80s, in the 70s and in the 80s. And it's the perpetrator is known as the Halloween sadist, and the perpetrator is always somebody who wants to intentionally hurt and kill children because they are sadists, because they did not have a great life, because that's just who they are. And that's in fact completely untrue. The one case that we do look at was a boy in Houston, Texas. He was 8 years old, and his name is Timothy O'Brien. And one night he was out trick-or-treating, and he got a pixie stick. And he went home and ate the pixie stick, and a few minutes later he started to vomit, and he was brought to the emergency room and died almost immediately from cyanide poisoning. Somebody had put cyanide in the pixie stick. For about a week, everybody was thinking, here's a case of somebody actually being killed by one of these Halloween sadists. And in fact, it turned out to be his father was the one who did it. His father put cyanide in the pixie stick. And he did it because he had heard all the cases of tainted Halloween candy, and he thought this would be the perfect crime. He thought the urban legend would cover up the crime that he was committing, and he did it for insurance money. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that when it was investigated, there were no actual cases, and so suddenly this suspicion was brought back upon him. The police looked at it, and suddenly they decided to convict him of the crime. And so this is something very interesting in the world of urban legends and in the world of folklore. It's called ostension, and that's when somebody enacts an urban legend thinking that it's real. They want to enact the urban legend. For example, the other urban legend of devil worshippers in the woods. Kids go out in the woods. They love to play. They love to paint 666 and build fires and sacrifice cats. Well, sometimes the police are called, and the police go out there and they say, "Oh, look, evidence of devil worshiping," when it's in fact just the kids pretending, playing. So it becomes this big game of telephone. Mm-hmm. That's called ostension, and that's what happened in this case. He thought the urban legend was real.
Now he had a sister, Elizabeth, right?
Yeah, he had a young sister.
But she didn't eat the poison candy? She didn't. Oh.
No, in fact, 4 children were given. He had actually tried to kill 4 children to cover up the death of his child. He gave out 4 pixie sticks to all the kids, and thank God nobody ate them. One of the kids fell asleep with the pixie stick in his hand. He couldn't open the pixie stick because it had been restapled too tightly.
Wow, lucky for him. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, what about Helen File? Helen File.
Helen File is the actual first legitimate case of somebody tainted candy. But again, nobody was injured, nobody was hurt, and she was just a woman who was upset. She lived on Long Island, and she was apparently crabby, and she was upset with the older kids always coming and asking for candy. So she put ant buttons and steel wool and dog biscuits. But she told the kids that this was happening. This is a completely different case. There's one other case. A kid, I forget where it was. I think it was in California. A young boy had died ingesting heroin. And what happened was he got into his uncle's heroin stash and ate the heroin and overdosed. But the family, in an attempt to protect the uncle, said that he had been given this heroin via the Halloween sadist as tainted Halloween candy. So that was another case.
Now with this Ronald O'Brien who poisoned, who was charged with killing his son, what happened to him?
He became quite famous. His name's the Candyman. That's what they call him. The Candyman of Houston. And in fact, there was another Candyman of Houston, interestingly enough, named Neil Coral, who was a serial killer who John Wayne Gacy ended up modeling some of his MOs on that guy, and he ended up killing like 27 people. But Ronald Clark O'Brien is the real Candyman of Houston. And Ron Clark O'Brien went to prison, but what's interesting was he got caught up as a poster child for anti-death penalty. And so when there was a stay of the death penalty, he languished in prison until finally we reinstituted the death penalty in Texas, and finally Ronald Clark O'Brien was executed. He was the second person to be executed after we reinstituted the death penalty, and he was killed in Huntsville, Texas, the most infamous death chamber in all of the United States.
Okay, let's move on now to When a Stranger Calls.
The babysitter.
I love this one.
Right, the babysitter and the man upstairs. And, that's the name of the urban legend. And of course, this was one of the first times, in fact, that an urban legend, almost in its complete entirety, was remade into a movie. Do you know what movie that was?
Oh, yeah. I can't. Go ahead. Yes. Oh, yeah. When a Stranger Calls.
When a Stranger Calls, that's right. So here you had a movie taking the urban legend almost word for word, redoing it in the first 20 minutes, and then the rest of the movie is almost just kind of like a replay of that urban legend. And When a Stranger Calls is a very scary film. Obviously it's a babysitter's home alone, she's talking on the phone, or maybe she's entertaining a boyfriend, and she suddenly gets a call, and the voice comes over and says, "Did you check the children?" She thinks it's a prank, someone's trying to scare her, she hangs up, guy calls back again, says, "Did you check the children?" This time there's a devilish laugh. She hangs up, now she's scared. She calls the operator and says, "Operator, somebody is harassing me, can you please trace the call?" And she hangs up, and then the guy calls back again, "Did you check the children?" And she screams, "Leave me alone." She hangs up the phone. All of a sudden, the police or the operator call back and say, "Get out of the house now." And then she says, "Why?" And she says, "Because the calls are coming from inside the house."
Yeah, that is.
And at that moment, she looks over and sees the stranger coming down the stairs, typically with the heads of the dead children.
The heads of the dead children.
Well, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes she makes it out, sometimes she doesn't make it out. Sometimes the kids come running down, sometimes they don't. So in this case, what's interesting here is we try to find some examples of babysitters being victims. And you would think, with so many films, Halloween, remember Jamie Lee Curtis, she was the babysitter. In fact, the original name for Halloween was called The Babysitter Killer.
Oh, it was?
Mm-hmm. So, very interesting. And there's so many movies about babysitters. And so we thought, there must be some truth to this story. But what we found is that there's really not a lot of stories about, thankfully so, true crimes about babysitters being killed while babysitting. However, there is a lot of examples of babysitters killing children. Now, which leads you to another urban legend, and that's called the turkeys in the oven, or the LSD urban legend. And that's a young couple, first-time parents, have a baby. They're going to go out for the first time since having their child. They're very nervous. They call up, they find this babysitter. She's a little hippie, but that's okay. She says, "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine." They go out to a movie. The wife gets very nervous in the middle of the movie or in the middle of dinner, calls the babysitter to check in, see how everything's going. Babysitter says, "Oh, everything's fine. Baby's upstairs asleep." And the turkey's in the oven. And the mother goes, "What turkey?" And all of a sudden the parents rush home, and there they found that the babysitter has put the baby in the oven.
Oh my!
What happened is that she had taken acid, LSD, freaked out, and put the baby in the oven.
Oh my God!
That's really a cautionary tale. As we said, all urban legends, or many urban legends, are really just cautionary tales, telling you to be wary of something.
Okay, now what about Janet Christman?
Right. So now there's a real case that we did find in Columbia, Missouri. The girl's name is Jeanette Christman. She was killed while babysitting. Somebody came through the front of the house. She was actually on the phone, just like the urban legend, and had called the police. And all of a sudden the line went dead. They couldn't trace the call because it was back in the 1950s. They didn't have that technology. The people who owned the house came home, and they found her. She had been strangled to death, but the baby was still alive. She had also been raped. Now, what's very interesting is that this was in the 1950s in Columbia, Missouri. They ended up arresting a man for the crime. He was an African-American guy. They got him to confess, and then they killed him. And then a couple years later, another babysitter died. Very similar circumstances, a couple blocks from Jeanette Christman. She too had been strangled with a cord. She too had been raped.
That was Mary Lou Jenkins.
That's correct, Mary Lou Jenkins. Mary Lou Jenkins was not babysitting at the time, but she had been known to babysit, and it was a young girl. It was very much the same MO. All of a sudden, some of the police realized maybe they put the wrong guy to death. However, interestingly enough, they arrested another African American guy and tried to get him to commit to the crime. He didn't. He was arrested, and then they ended up arresting a Caucasian man. He was a little bit more prominent in the neighborhood, although they could never convict him of the crime, and he ended up going free.
Really? So how many more of these babysitting strangulations occurred after the other two fellows were incarcerated?
Well, interestingly enough, they stopped, but there were numerous rapes in the town going on at the time. But also, it could be they stopped because the police finally did arrest this one guy. Again, he was never charged with crime, but he then moved away.
Oh.
So that could be the case
Yeah.
too.
Now, what about this Robert Mueller? Is that who you were talking about?
That's the name of the guy who had been suspected of the crimes. Mueller. Interestingly enough, Mueller had called Jeanette Crispin to babysit the same night he was babysitting for the other family. So he knew she would be alone in the house. He also may or may not, it's hard to prove, knew Jenkins. So it's a real kind of murder mystery, this urban legend. This is not, an open and shut case. And again, that's the whole thing with urban legends. Urban legends take their information from crimes which typically are not solved or have some questions that remain. And it's these questions that remain that allow us to then kind of embellish on the crime and make it turn into an urban legend. And again, the point of an urban legend is it's a cautionary tale. So for the Candyman, what's the cautionary tale? Don't take candy from strangers. Don't go to strangers' houses. Don't go to people you don't know. Don't trust strange people. There are people who are out there to hurt children. What's the cautionary tale from babysitting? Well, in this one, it's a reminder to be careful of your womanly duties. Don't talk on the phone. Don't entertain strange boys. If you're hired as a babysitter, watch the babies, and because this is some kind of role play for motherhood. So, and these cautionary tales, they're very ingrained in a kind of conservative way. And so, some other people have interpreted it as, it's because this was a woman who was trying to enter the workforce, make some money as a babysitter, and he was saying, look, you shouldn't be so capitalistic, you shouldn't be so quick to venture out into the workforce, or else you're gonna, your babies will die.
So let's move on now. You just touched a little bit on the Hook, but also the Phantom, the Masked Man.
Right, the Phantom Clowns. And what's interesting is that this has been coming up quite a bit recently in the news. There was a Phantom Clown scare in Northampton, England, and there was just a Phantom Clown scare, strangely enough, in Staten Island recently. So this is about something that happened in the 1980s. Late 70s or early 80s again. There were Phantom Clown scares. There were communities of children who believed that they had seen men driving around, typically in white vans, dressed like clowns that were trying to snatch them.
Oh, you jumped ahead of me.
Why?
But go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, finish. We'll do the clowns. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So this is the clowns. So in this case, throughout the 80s, children were seeing these men driving around dressed like clowns. And what's so interesting to me about this urban legend, it's more hysteria. In this case, the question is, how did this Phantom Clown scare start? First, it starts in places like Newark. Then it goes to Scotland. Then it goes to Galveston, Texas. And then it goes all over the country, all over the world. Now it's in Latin America. But what's interesting is this was happening pre-internet age. So how was word spreading about these Phantom Clowns?
Yeah.
pre-internet age, and we went to Chicago because that's where there was a prevalent phantom clown scare. And what was interesting in Chicago, people have looked at it. It wasn't just one demographic of kids. It wasn't just African American kids or upper income kids. This was everywhere. There was Hasidic kids were seeing phantom clowns, African American kids, privileged, non-privileged. And so again, pre-internet age, how was this passing between isolated groups of kids between isolated towns pre-internet? And so, a lot of it is really about how clowns became so creepy. They're originally supposed to be these kind of lovable, fun characters, but somewhere along the way they turned creepy. Somewhere along the way we start to see these phantom clown scares. And some people believe that a lot of it started, with Stephen King, It, or with Poltergeist. But actually, the phantom clown scares started before that. And a lot of people kind of peg the beginning to be John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer from Chicago, who dressed as a clown. Now, what's interesting about Gacy is that he never actually killed anyone as a clown, but he's always associated with being Pogo the Clown, the dark side of the serial killer.
So Josh, when he dressed up as a clown, that was a character? He was Pogo the Clown? Would he attend functions as Pogo the Clown?
Yeah, he would do all this stuff, but what's interesting, he would do birthday parties and things, but again, he never killed as the clown. A lot of the movies that you see now, they show John Wayne Gacy as the killer clown, but that's not what he ever did. He liked to put on masks, and he liked to dress up to be something he wasn't, but he was never quite evil.
Josh, what is your take on that? Since you like to investigate murders and mysteries and stuff, wouldn't you think that if he stayed dressed up as a clown, that would make it easier for him to do his killings, because he would be somebody else. He would be Pogo and not John Wayne Gacy. That's
what I think about Gacy is that, and what we say is that his normal stuff was pretty sadistic, and so he dressed like a clown to have a break from being so sadistic. He liked always to be the center of attention, but then he could be the center of attention but not be so sadistic. It was John Wayne Gacy, the normal human being, who was the killer. He was he would lure teenage boys. He dressed like a cop, actually. He dressed like a police officer and went to a park where all these young boys were hanging out, prostituting themselves, and he would fake arrest them, put them in handcuffs, and bring them back to his house. So he was a guy who kind of dressed up a lot. He liked to wear a lot of different hats, and he liked to be a lot of different roles, and he liked to be the center of attention.
You know what I've noticed in your documentary? That most of these killer legends, they're all referred to as boogeyman.
Well, I really find that to be very interesting. I'm kind of fascinated with the idea of the boogeyman. And where the name the boogeyman came from?
No.
Apparently there was a group called the Boogies. They were, I forget exactly where, but it's Indonesia. They were a tribe, and they would sail on balsa wood boats that were very, very light and didn't make a lot of noise. And they would creep up next to you in the middle of the night and snatch the women and children. And so that is how the name Boogeyman came into play.
Wow, okay. So now he also, what's the self-portrait that he did?
Right. Well, I think that goes to the fact that Gacy liked dressing up as a clown, but I don't think he knew. I mean, there's, who knows what's in his mind. I don't think he knew how creepy he was. I think only as culture went on, we started to create clowns as being more creepy. But then I think once we found all these people, there's tons of people out there who love serial killers and they're obsessed with serial killer memorabilia. I find it pretty macabre, but, and they love the fact that he was this killer clown because it's so absolutely scary. So I think he started to then, in prison, as a way to get attention, was to kind of make self-portraits of him as Pogo the Clown, because I think the public really liked the public idolized him as that killer clown, and I think he bought into that.
Wow. And he killed what, 33 people, right?
Yeah, 33 young boys.
And
Yeah,
they found them all in the was it underneath the house?
yeah, yeah. We actually talked to Bob Egan. Uh, they didn't find all 33. They believe he killed upwards of 45 people. And in fact, there's some very interesting people right now. If you do some research online, you can find some interesting detectives who are believe that they know where there are other bodies buried.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. In
Hmm.
the neighborhoods.
So let's go. Okay, now let's go back. Let's go to the Phantom, the hooded.
Right. Now
Oops.
this is the probably the most popular urban legend. Uh, the the hook for a hand, and this one became famous in the 1940s, 1950s. This urban legend, again, the couple making out in the front seat of the car. News flash comes over the radio: "Go home, lock your doors." Coitus interruptus between the boy and the girl. She says she wants to go home. The boyfriend's obviously frustrated because he can't, get that sex, and he jams on the gas pedal, pulls away, takes the girl back to her house, and as he's opening up her door, he sees dangling from the door handle the maniac's bloody hook. And so they were just minutes away from getting killed if the girl hadn't thankfully said that she wanted to go home. Now, what's that cautionary tale about? That's about premarital sex, telling you that you shouldn't have premarital sex, or else you're going to get killed with a hook. You're going to get penetrated with a hook. And so, very obviously conservative cautionary tale there. Now, there's some speculation as to where this might have come from, but we do know that in Texarkana, Texas, in the 1940s, there were 4 couples who were killed in the front seats of their cars and some other places by a mysterious man known as the Phantom in Texarkana. And what's very interesting to me is that he's never been caught, or they think they know who did it, but he was never caught. And the kind of legacy of the Phantom still lives on today. One of the reasons a lot of these urban legends live on is through film. We
Mm-hmm.
no longer tell them orally around the campfire. We put them in movies, just like the Babysitter Killer, just like the Killer Clowns, just like all of our other urban legends. The Hook, the Phantom, especially of Texarkana, was immortalized in the 1976 cult classic film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, directed by Charles B. Pierce. Now, what's amazing about Charles B. Pierce is that his film before that was called The Legend of Boggy Creek, one of the most successful independent films of all time, and a very weird movie. And what was so interesting about it was the way it blended reality and fictionalized filmmaking back in the day. It was almost like a found footage movie. In fact, it was the first found footage movie, and the makers of Blair Witch said that The Legend of Boggy Creek was one of their inspirations.
Really?
Yeah, and
Ah.
this is Charles B. Pierce. Now, Charles B. Pierce lived in Texarkana, Texas, and so he made this story about he made this movie about this story that affected him as a child, and this phantom who was never caught, who terrorized all these kids in the hometown. Now, what's also very interesting is that in the way in which the film is a quasi documentary, and it says that the killer could still be walking around today, and it shows you the killer kind of walking around. Very interesting, and ever since the movie came out, because it purported to be a documentary, there were certain liberties that were taken story-wise, and now the residents of Texarkana believe the movie rather than the facts of the case. The movie has taken over as the urban legend.
Like the incident with was it Betty Joe Booker?
And the
Yeah.
trombone, that's right. Betty Jo Booker was shot and killed. But in the movie, Charles B. Pierce wanted to kind of jazz it up a little bit, and so he ended up having the Phantom tie Betty Jo Booker to a tree, and tying a knife to her trombone. She was not a trombone player, but she carried a trombone in the movie, and the Phantom stabbed her repeatedly while she was tied against a tree with this knife attached with trombone. Now, a lot of people think that's how Betty Booker Joe was really killed. In reality, Betty Jo Booker was a saxophone player.
Right.
It's very hard to kill someone with a saxophone like that. And so they think that they know that's become the new reality. That's become the new truth. And so what we were interested in is not only that, the question is kind of like, how do the movies affect the true crime? How do the movies affect the case? And what's interesting here, what the town does is every year they play The Town That Dreaded Sundown at a special outdoor screening in Spring Lake Park where one of the murders occurred, very close to the site where the murders happened. So what's happening? Folklorists would call this legend tripping. And that's something that a lot of people do. It's where you kind of go to the spot where a murder or a sighting or the haunted house in your neighborhood, you go there as a kid or a young adult or even as an older adult, and you like to kind of test the bounds of whether you're scared or not. You like to get your blood racing and your heart flowing. Sometimes you like to bring a girl there, and that's why they say scare the pants off somebody. And so it's an opportunity to hook up. And so what we have here is this town, by watching the film, this kind of oral, this kind of visual retelling of the urban legend over the visual campfire of the movie screen, and they're doing it in the same place where the murders happen. They're all legend tripping. And so it's very interesting to me as a folklorist to kind of see that stuff. And now what's funny is the town can never seem to escape the specter of the phantom, because the crimes happened in the 40s and were never solved, because the film came out in 1976 and it made everybody relive it because they show the films in the town every year. And now Ryan Murphy, the same guy who did American Horror Story and has given shouts out to Cropsey for using that as part of his inspiration for the second season, he is remaking The Town That Dreaded Sundown, and this time it's about a copycat murderer who comes out from the screening. So in a lot of ways we have life imitating art, imitating life, imitating art, and the snake eating the tail.
Now, these murders at that particular time, they were called the Moonlight Murders?
Yeah, they were called the Moonlight Murders.
And they were because the murders were happening, what, at a full moon?
Well, it's said that they happen around the full moon, but that wasn't actually the case.
Okay. Now, what this reminds me of? Now, so this was a Lover's Lane type area where these young people would go to.
Yep.
And how many murders did this phantom kill in that area?
I think he killed 5 people, but he also shot a couple in a farmhouse as well. They said that the hook for a hand might not have come from this case, but it could have happened from the Carol Chessman, the Carol Chessman murders, the Red Light Bandit.
Oh yeah.
Which happened in California off Mulholland in the 1960s.
Yeah. Well, this also reminds me of the Zodiac.
Yeah, exactly. It has a lot of shades of the Zodiac as well. And what's very interesting to me is that a lot of it's also very logical when it comes to crime. I mean, if you're crazy and you want to kind of kill couples or maybe rape a girl, where else are you going to do it? Where's a better place to do it than at some kind of desolate Lover's Lane, where you're going to catch 2 people in a compromising position, where you're going to find a man and a woman already having sex, and where chances are there's not going to be a lot of law enforcement or a lot of other people who aren't going to be around to see them, because you're going to Lover's Lane to kind of make out, to be hidden.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, it was I absolutely love your documentary. Absolutely love it. Now, Josh, do you have a website, or where can people go to get your documentaries?
They can, perhaps you can see on Hulu or Netflix. You can go to our website, www.cropsylegend.com. That has, you can buy a DVD there that has like about 45 minutes of deleted scenes that weren't in the documentary. And if you haven't seen that, it's very interesting because it adds a whole nother dimension to the case, because there's about 45 minutes of things that we couldn't put in the movie that are very interesting. You can see that off the website. And of course, you can catch Cropsy on on Facebook as well.
Awesome. And then what about Killer Legends?
Killer Legends should be showing again on Chiller, and if you don't have Chiller, it will be coming out streaming, and you can also ask on Facebook, and we can tell you how to get your own copy.
Josh, thank you so much. I know you're so busy. Oh my God, you took time out to do my show. I'm so excited. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you. And after you do your other documentary, I hope you will come back and we can talk about it.
Oh, I will. Thank you very much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Everybody, thanks so much. Thank Josh for being on the show with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please don't forget to give us a like and please subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Bye, Josh.
Thank you.
Hold on.